Hello, students. Let's do a quick summary of lesson 3, making sure we understand and have all the important parts from this lesson. This lesson focused on whether or not factors of climate were related to the increase in the buffalo population between 1960 and 1975. So, again, let's talk about what climate. Climate is determined by two factors. Climate is looking at the average patterns in time over regarding temperature and precipitation amounts. So, one thing we have to do before we start looking at information is we have to make a hypothesis. We have to make a prediction. So, by looking at the buffalo population from 1960 to 75, we see that it's an increasing amount. If, so we're going to play if then, if rainfall was the reason for the increased number of buffalo, meaning that the buffalo increased because of having uh, their access to water or their access to the water, which also helps with the access to food. What would we expect the rainfall amount to look like if the rainfall was responsible for the growth? And what we would expect is we should also expect if we looked at if we were to look at a graph of rainfall, we should expect a fancy word would be positive correlation. We should expect that if the rainfall goes up, the buffalo population goes up. If rainfall is the reason. So we should expect increasing rainfall to cause increasing buffalo. Again, if and only if rainfall is the reason. So after we look at that, now we should expect an increasing rainfall if it is the reason. So let's look at what the actual data shows us. The actual data shows us each year over time the average temperature. And this yellow line in the center represents the trend line or the slope of the line of best fit. It gives us an average pattern over time of what changes occurred. If we look at both the temperature line, we see a very, very small change in the average temperature over those years. If we look at our rainfall, we do see some varying rainfall, and it looks like our annual rainfall averages decreases. But when we look closer at the data, we see that it changes by 3 millimeters. And then we have to think about, what does 3 millimeters look like in terms of amount? 3 millimeters is less than the height of a pen. Okay, so a height of a pen is about 4 to 5 millimeters. And so 3 millimeters, we were saying that between 1960 and 1975, the change in average rain was about this much. That's not very much at all. So the data shows us that there wasn't much of a change in either temperature or rainfall. Now, does that match up with what we said we would need to see if rainfall was a factor? Well, if there's no change in a factor, in this case rainfall, no change in a factor means it's not going to cause change in something else. So when we see change in a population, but there's no change in the rainfall, well, we know that rainfall was not the reason for the change in buffalo population. So by this point in lesson 3, we have eliminated several possibilities. We know it's not the amount of food, right? Because food is related to the amount of rainfall and sunlight. We know that the rainfall didn't change very much, which means the amount of food didn't change very much. We know that it's not food, it's not water. We know it's not the amount of space available because the Serengeti didn't change in size between 1960 and 1975. We determined that it was not competition from other organisms in our reading. We also determined back in lesson 2 that the buffalo are eating different vegetation or different species, and so they're not in direct competition with a lot of animals for that food resource. So as we move on into lesson 4, we're going to look at another factor.